Frozen chances. The snow fell in thick, lazy flakes outside the gleaming windows of Reed Technologies' downtown headquarters. Nathaniel Reed stood at his office window, 42 floors above Boston, watching the evening commuters scurry like ants below. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Tailored charcoal suit, precisely trimmed beard, eyes that had forgotten how to smile. "Mr. Reed?" His assistant's voice broke through his thoughts. "Your brother's on line one. Says it's urgent." Nathaniel suppressed a sigh. "Thank you, Vivian." He walked to his desk and picked up the phone. "Thomas, what can I do for you?" "Father's making changes to the board structure," Thomas said without preamble. "He's allocating voting shares based on family stability. His words, not mine." Nathaniel's grip tightened on the receiver. Meaning married executives. Get more voting power. It's his way of forcing you to settle down before he retires. The Winter Gala is in 2 weeks, and he expects you to bring someone serious. After ending the call, Nathaniel grabbed his coat and headed out, needing air. The family business, founded by his grandfather, expanded by his father, had been Nathaniel's life for 15 years. At 38, he'd sacrificed everything for it, and now his position was threatened because he hadn't found time for marriage. He walked through the public garden, snow crunching beneath his Italian leather shoes. Near the bridge, he noticed a woman sitting on a bench, hunched over a notebook, seemingly oblivious to the cold. She wrote furiously, her breath forming clouds in the air. Curiosity drew him closer. Most of the garden's visitors had sought shelter from the weather, yet here she was, writing as though her life depended on it. "Excuse me," he said. "The temperature's dropping. Are you all right?" She looked up, startled. Her face was striking, not conventionally beautiful, but intelligent and intense. Her eyes, deep brown and sharp, assessed him with surprising confidence, given her circumstances. "I'm fine," she replied, closing her notebook. "Just finishing some thoughts before the library closes." Nathaniel noticed her worn backpack and the layers of mismatched clothing. Despite this, she carried herself with dignity that commanded respect. "I'm Nathaniel," he said, surprising himself with the introduction. "Josephine," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Most people call me Joe. May I buy you coffee? You look like you could use something warm." She raised an eyebrow. "Do I look like I need charity, Nathaniel?" "No," he answered honestly. "You look like someone with an interesting story, and I've had a terrible day. Consider it a favor to me." A small smile played at her lips. "Well, when you put it that way." At the cafe across the street, Joe revealed snippets of her story. Once a respected investigative journalist, she'd lost everything after exposing corruption at a publication owned by powerful interests. Blacklisted, sued, and eventually evicted. She'd spent the past 8 months between shelters and the streets, still writing, still pursuing freelance work. "The system's designed to make people like me invisible," she said, warming her hands around her mug. "But I refuse to disappear." Something about her resilience struck Nathaniel. An idea, absurd, desperate, possibly brilliant, began forming in his mind. "Joe," he said carefully, "I have a proposition that might sound unusual. I need someone to pose as my fiancé for my family's winter gala. It's in 2 weeks at my father's estate. 1 weekend of pretending, and I'll pay you enough to get back on your feet." Her expression hardened. "You want to rent a homeless woman to impress your rich family? That's quite a proposal." "It's not about—" He stopped, reconsidering. "Actually, you're right. It is exactly that callous. I apologize." He started to stand, but her voice stopped him. "How much?" she asked, her expression unreadable. $20,000, he replied. Joe studied him, her journalist's eyes seeing more than he intended to reveal. "Why me? Surely you know women who do this for much less." "Because, Nathaniel, admitted, "You're the first person who's spoken to me like a human being in longer than I can remember." The snow continued falling outside as Jo weighed her options, her dignity against practical necessity, while Nathaniel waited for her answer, unaware that this desperate arrangement would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. Paper promises. The Reed family estate sprawled across 20 acres of pristine New England countryside, its Georgian architecture a testament to old money and older traditions. As Nathaniel's car crunched up the gravel driveway, Jo pressed her palms against her borrowed dress, a midnight blue gown that Nathaniel's stylist had selected. "Remember," Nathaniel said, adjusting his cufflinks, "we met at a charity fundraiser for literacy programs. You challenged me on my company's community involvement, and I was smitten by your honesty." Jo nodded, committing the fabrication to memory. 6 months of dating. You proposed in Kyoto during cherry blossom season. I still work as a freelance journalist, but I'm focusing on a book about economic inequality. "Perfect," Nathaniel replied. "My family respects ambition, even if they're suspicious of journalism." The transformation of Josephine Winters had been meticulous. After accepting his proposition, she'd spent the past 2 weeks in Nathaniel's guest apartment, undergoing what he called strategic preparation. She'd received a new wardrobe, salon appointments, and intensive briefings on the Reed family dynamics. Nathaniel had been surprised by how quickly she absorbed information, her journalist's mind mapping connections and potential pitfalls. "Your Brother Thomas resents you because your father favors you despite your reluctance to embrace family values," Jo recited. "Your cousin Patricia runs the foundation and will interrogate me about my charitable interests. Your father, Edward, built the company from a regional business to a national power, but is old-fashioned and believes a man isn't complete without a wife." Nathaniel looked impressed. "You'd make an excellent corporate spy." "I prefer to think of it as thorough reporting," she replied, a hint of her old confidence showing through. As they entered the grand foyer, decorated with evergreen garlands and vintage ornaments, Nathaniel's hand found the small of Jo's back. The touch was professional, practiced, part of their choreography. "Nathaniel, you actually came." A woman in her early 30s approached, her resemblance to Nathaniel unmistakable. "And you brought a guest." "Eleanor, this is Josephine Winters, my fiancée," Nathaniel said. "Jo, my sister." Eleanor's eyebrows shot up. "Fiancée? Not just a date?" She extended her hand to Jo. "Well, you're either a saint or insane to take on my brother. Which is it?" Jo took her hand warmly. "A bit of both, probably. It's wonderful to meet you." "Nathaniel mentioned you're a pediatric surgeon?" Eleanor's surprise was evident. "He talked about me? That's new?" She gave her brother a curious look before turning back to Jo. "Yes, at Boston Children's. Not the Reed family business. But someone has to rebel. The good doctor has arrived." A booming voice echoed across the hall as a tall, distinguished man with Nathaniel's jawline and steel-gray hair descended the staircase. "And Nathaniel, with a guest! Extraordinary!" Edward Reed approached with the confident stride of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. His assessing gaze swept over Jo, cataloging details with business-like efficiency. "Father, this is Josephine Winters," Nathaniel said. "My fiancée." The word hung in the air. Edward's expression shifted from surprise to calculation to pleasure in the span of seconds. "Well now," he said, taking Jo's hand between both of his. "This is unexpected. Welcome to our home, Ms. Winters. I look forward to getting to know the woman who finally captured my son's heart." The evening unfolded like a complex theatrical production. Jo moved through conversations with the precision of someone who had interviewed presidents and criminals alike, adapting to each family member's conversational style. She charmed Nathaniel's aunt with discussions of Boston history, impressed his cousin with knowledge of sustainable development, and gently deflected personal questions with practiced ease. Nathaniel watched her, occasionally catching her eye. Across the room with subtle nods of approval. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of family expectation lifting from his shoulders. During dinner, placed beside Nathaniel at the massive oak table, Jo played her role flawlessly until Edward Reed directed his attention toward her. "Journalism is a challenging field these days," he commented, "especially for someone with principles." Jo's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "The best things usually require some struggle, Mr. Reed." "Edward, please." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I admire persistence. Tell me, what publications feature your work currently?" Nathaniel tensed beside her. This was the delicate part of their fiction. Jo's current professional situation was too close to her actual circumstances. "I'm between major assignments," Jo replied smoothly. "I left my last position at The Atlantic after editorial disagreements. My book is my focus now." "Fascinating," Edward said. "What's it about?" "The intersection of corporate influence and housing instability," Jo answered, meeting his gaze directly. "How policy decisions benefit certain stakeholders while creating invisible victims." A silence fell over the nearby conversations. Nathaniel reached for his water glass. "Bold topic," Edward finally said. "I'd be interested in your research methods. Reed Developments has significant housing investments." "I'm aware," Jo replied with a smile that masked the bitterness Nathaniel had glimpsed during their first conversation. "Nathaniel has been remarkably open about his family's business interests. It's one of the things I admire about him, his willingness to examine difficult questions." Edward's eyebrows rose slightly as he turned to his son. "Is that so? I wasn't aware you had developed such social consciousness." "Jo has been influential," Nathaniel said, reaching for her hand atop the table. The gesture, unrehearsed, felt strangely natural. "She sees things differently than we do." Later, as musicians played in the grand salon and guests mingled with cocktails, Jo found herself momentarily alone on the terrace, breathing in the cold night air. The reality of her situation, standing in borrowed finery, surrounded by wealth, while her few possessions remained in a storage locker, hit her with sudden force. "Quite a performance," came Eleanor's voice as she stepped onto the terrace. "You've got everyone convinced, almost." Jo turned, her expression carefully neutral. "Almost? My brother doesn't look at you the way a man looks at his fiancée," Eleanor said. "He looks at you the way someone regards a fascinating puzzle." Jo's heart raced. Discovery would mean humiliation for both of them. "We all show affection differently," she offered. Eleanor laughed softly. "True, but Nathaniel has never brought anyone home before, not once. So whatever this is," she gestured between Jo and the party inside, "it's significant. Just be careful. This family breaks things it doesn't understand." As Eleanor returned inside, Jo remained in the cold, clear night, watching her breath form clouds. The role she was playing had seemed straightforward when she accepted Nathaniel's money. Now, surrounded by the reality of his world, the boundaries between performance and truth were beginning to blur in ways neither of them had anticipated. Unscripted moments. Morning light filtered through heavy curtains as Jo awoke in the guest bedroom of the Reed estate. The previous night's gala had been exhausting, a marathon of small talk and strategic impression management. After breakfast, most guests would depart, but Nathaniel had arranged for them to stay an additional day, cementing the seriousness of their relationship in his father's eyes. A soft knock at the door preceded the entrance of a uniformed staff member. "Ms. Winters, Mr. Reed has requested your presence for a walk around the grounds at 10, if that suits you." Jo glanced at the antique clock on the bedside table. 9:15. "Thank you. Please tell him I'll meet him in the foyer." Dressed in The casual but expensive clothes Nathaniel had provided, Jo made her way downstairs, passing family photographs that traced generations of Reed's success. Nathaniel waited by the front door in a sweater and wool coat, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I have in months," she admitted. "Though I kept expecting someone to realize I don't belong here and escort me out." "You played your part perfectly," Nathaniel said as they stepped outside into the crisp morning air. "My father is completely convinced. He cornered me after you went upstairs, talking about adjusting his succession plans." They walked in silence, along a path that wound through bare maple trees and snow-covered gardens. Jo noticed Nathaniel's distracted expression. "Something's bothering you," she observed. "Having second thoughts about our arrangement?" He shook his head. "No, it's Eleanor. Something you said to her must have made an impression. She's asked me to meet her at the boathouse. We haven't had a real conversation in years." The rebellion in the family, Jo recalled. "What happened between you two?" Nathaniel's pace slowed. "After our mother died, I threw myself into the family business. Eleanor wanted to use her portion of the inheritance to establish a foundation focusing on children's health care in underserved communities. Father saw it as a rejection of the family legacy. I sided with him. And now she's a pediatric surgeon," Jo said. "She followed her conscience anyway, at the cost of her relationship with our father, and largely with me." He stopped at a fork in the path. "The boathouse is this way. Would you mind coming with me? Eleanor respects you. I saw it last night." Studied him, trying to separate the businessman who had hired her from the man now asking for emotional support. "This wasn't in our agreement." "I know," he acknowledged. "Consider it a favor, or an additional $1,000 if you prefer." "Not everything has a price tag, Nathaniel," Jo replied, but fell into step beside him. The boathouse sat at the edge of a frozen lake, its weathered wooden structure contrasting with the main house's grandeur. Eleanor waited inside, where a small fire burned in an old stove. She looked up as they entered, surprise crossing her face at Jo's presence. "I asked her to come," Nathaniel said quickly. "Whatever you want to say to me, you can say in front of Jo." Eleanor's eyes moved between them. "Interesting. Sit down then." For the next hour, Jo witnessed the unraveling of a decade of family tension. Eleanor spoke of feeling abandoned after their mother's death, of Nathaniel's gradual transformation into their father's image. Nathaniel defended his choices while acknowledging the distance they had created. Jo occasionally offered observations that neither sibling had considered, her outsider perspective providing clarity. "You're both still grieving your mother," she said during a lull in conversation. "But instead of doing it together, you're using your father as a proxy for your pain." Eleanor stared at Jo, then laughed softly. "Well, she certainly doesn't mince words. Where did you find her, Nate?" The childhood. Nicknames seemed to affect Nathaniel deeply. "A park bench, actually," he said with unexpected honesty. "What?" Eleanor looked confused. Jo and Nathaniel exchanged glances. Some version of the truth seemed necessary. "We didn't meet at a charity event," Jo admitted. "It was less conventional." Before Eleanor could press further, the boathouse door opened, revealing Edward Reed. "Here you all are," he said, scanning the unlikely gathering. "Eleanor, I didn't realize you were staying." "I wasn't planning to," Eleanor replied, standing. "But Jo suggested I give you another chance to have a conversation about the foundation proposal." Edward's expression hardened. "I've made my position clear." "Perhaps," Jo interjected, "but circumstances change. The Reed Family Children's Health Initiative would create tremendous goodwill, especially given recent criticism of corporate health care. Investments." Nathaniel and Eleanor both turned to her in surprise. "Ms. Winters," Edward said carefully, "family business discussions are generally kept within the family, and I'm about to become family," Jo countered with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Moreover, I'm a journalist who specializes in corporate social responsibility. Eleanor's proposal isn't just ethically sound, it's good business. A tense silence filled the boathouse. Then, unexpectedly, Edward laughed. "Nathaniel," he said, "you've finally found someone as stubborn as yourself." He turned to Eleanor. "Send me the updated proposal. I'll review it with the board." As Edward left, Eleanor stared at Joe with newfound respect. "That was impressive. Just applying journalistic principles," Joe replied, "finding leverage and using it appropriately." Later, as they prepared to return to Boston, Nathaniel pulled Joe aside in the estate's library. "Thank you," he said quietly. "What you did for Eleanor, for me, wasn't part of our deal." Joe shrugged. "Consider it professional courtesy. Besides, her foundation could genuinely help people." Nathaniel studied her face. "You're not what I expected, Josephine Winters." "Neither are you," she admitted. "For a corporate titan, you're surprisingly human underneath all that expensive tailoring." Something shifted in the air between them. An acknowledgement that their arrangement had become more complicated than either had intended. As Nathaniel moved closer, the library door opened, and Thomas entered. "Car's ready," he announced, looking between them with curiosity. "Though I can tell them to wait if you two need a moment." "We're coming," Nathaniel replied, the professional mask sliding back into place. But as they followed Thomas out, his hand found Joe's, fingers intertwining, in a gesture that wasn't for show. Truth in the frost January brought bitter cold to Boston, but inside Nathaniel's penthouse, Joe barely noticed the weather. The 3 weeks since the Reed family gathering had transformed her circumstances dramatically. Nathaniel had insisted she remain in his guest apartment until things were finalized, a vague timeline that seemed to extend with each passing day. The $20,000 sat untouched in a new bank account. Joe had used a small portion to replace essential items and subscribe to journalism databases. But the bulk remained, a ticket to a fresh start that she inexplicably hesitated to use. Their arrangement had evolved unspoken. Joe attended business, dinners with Nathaniel, offering insights that impressed his colleagues. He accompanied her to journalism events, using his connections to introduce her to editors who might commission her work. The pretense of their engagement continued in public, but in private, they maintained a careful distance, friends perhaps, but boundaries firmly in place, until tonight. "The Spencer Foundation is hosting a panel on urban development," Nathaniel said over breakfast, sliding an invitation across the table. "They've asked me to participate. I'd like you to come, not as my fiancé, but as a journalist. They're offering press credentials." Joe looked up from her laptop. "Why?" "Because you've been working on your housing piece for months, and this could provide valuable sources." He hesitated. "And because your perspective matters to me." The admission hung between them, more intimate than any staged kiss they'd shared for his family's benefit. "I'll come," she said finally, "as a journalist." The event was held at the Boston Convention Center, a gathering of developers, city officials, and housing advocates discussing the future of urban spaces. Joe sat in the press section, recorder and notebook ready, watching Nathaniel take his place on the panel alongside other industry leaders. The moderator began with pleasantries before turning to substance. "Mr. Reed, your company has recently acquired significant properties in historically working-class neighborhoods. How do you respond to concerns about gentrification and displacement?" Nathaniel leaned toward the microphone. "Reed Developments recognizes the complexity of urban renewal. We're implementing a stakeholder engagement model that prioritizes existing community needs alongside development goals." Joe wrote his answer verbatim, professional instincts overriding personal connection. The discussion continued, touching on affordable housing quotas, community benefits agreements, and tax incentives. Nathaniel spoke with conviction about balanced approaches and corporate responsibility. Then the moderator introduced the final panelist. Representing the Coalition for Housing Justice, Darrell Washington. A tall man with graying temples approached the stage. Thank you for having me, though I admit being surprised at the invitation, given that Reed Developments is currently evicting residents from the Riverside complex my organization represents. Joe's pen froze above her notebook. Nathaniel's expression remained neutral, but she recognized the slight tightening around his eyes. Mr. Washington, the moderator said, perhaps you could elaborate on your concerns? Certainly. Reed Properties acquired the Riverside Apartments in October. Despite promises to maintain affordable units, they've begun issuing eviction notices to longtime residents, many of whom are elderly or disabled. Our research indicates they're planning luxury condominiums. Joe felt the blood drain from her face. October, when she was still living in shelters, before she met Nathaniel. Mr. Reed, would you care to respond? The moderator asked. Nathaniel leaned forward. Reed Developments operates numerous properties. I'm not personally familiar with every acquisition, but I assure you that our company policies emphasize ethical treatment of existing tenants. With respect, Washington countered. The eviction notices bear your signature, the audience murmured. Joe stared at Nathaniel, searching for signs of the man who had reconnected with his sister, who had seemed genuinely interested in her perspectives on inequality. His face revealed nothing. After the panel, Joe waited in the reception area, declining. Canapes and champagne from passing servers. When Nathaniel finally emerged, deep in conversation with city officials, their eyes met across the room. He excused himself and approached her. You knew, she said before he could speak. About Riverside, Joe, don't. Her voice was steady. I interviewed residents there last summer for an article on housing insecurity. Mrs. Geller with her oxygen tank. The Rodriguez family with their 3 children. The veteran in 3B who helps everyone carry their groceries. Are those the people you're evicting? Nathaniel glanced around, aware of nearby ears. This isn't the place. When is the place? When they're already out on the street? Joe stepped closer, lowering her voice. You paid me $20,000 to pretend we were in love, while your company forces people into homelessness. Do you understand the irony? It's more complicated than... No, it's actually very simple, Joe interrupted. I convinced myself, you were different from other wealthy men I've investigated, that beneath the expensive suits and corporate jargon was someone who cared about more than profit margins. I was wrong. She removed the engagement ring, a convincing but costume piece, and placed it in his palm. Consider our arrangement terminated. I'll be out of your apartment by morning. Nathaniel's composed facade cracked. Joe, please, let me explain. Explain what? That business is business? That profit justifies everything? She shook her head. I've heard those explanations from better liars than you. As she turned to leave, he caught her arm. What we've built these past weeks, it wasn't all pretend. You know that. Joe looked at his hand on her arm, then back to his face. That's what makes it worse. Outside, snow had begun falling again, large flakes swirling in the streetlights. Joe walked away from the convention center, away from the warmth and security she'd temporarily enjoyed, back toward the uncertain future she'd been avoiding. Behind her, Nathaniel Reed stood watching, the small ring clutched in his hand, as the distance between their worlds expanded once more into an unbridgeable chasm. Bridges built spring came late to Boston that year. April brought tentative green to the public garden as Joe Winters sat on the same bench where Nathaniel Reed had found her 5 months earlier. Her circumstances had changed dramatically. A small but decent apartment in Somerville, regular freelance assignments, and a book contract with a respected publisher for her examination of housing inequality. She opened her laptop to review edits on her latest article, an exposé on corporate landlords that had generated significant attention in policy circles. The byline, Josephine Winters, was regaining its former weight in journalism, though the path back had been harder than she'd anticipated. The $20,000 had helped. After leaving Nathaniel's apartment that January night, she'd finally used the money, not for herself, but to establish a legal defense fund for the Riverside tenants. The resulting publicity had drawn pro bono attorneys to their cause, stalling the eviction process. Joe hadn't seen or spoken to Nathaniel since that night. She'd followed news of Reed developments through industry publications, noting with professional detachment the company's announcement of a strategic reorganization in March. According to business journals, Nathaniel Reed had stepped down as CEO, remaining on the board while focusing on a new division, Reed Community Partners. "Is this seat taken?" The familiar voice pulled Joe from her thoughts. Nathaniel stood before her, dressed more casually than she'd ever seen him. Jeans and a light sweater, no tie in sight. He looked different. Thinner, perhaps, with the barest hint of gray at his temples that hadn't been there before. "It's a public park," she replied, closing her laptop. He sat, maintaining a respectful distance. "I've been looking for you." "Not very successfully, apparently. I respected your desire for space," he corrected. "But I've followed your work. The Riverside piece was excellent." Joe studied him, searching for the corporate mask she'd grown to recognize. It wasn't there. "Why are you here, Nathaniel?" He looked out across the garden where daffodils pushed through the soil. "To apologize first. What happened at Riverside was indefensible. I delegated those decisions to the development team and wasn't paying attention to the human cost. That's not an excuse. It's a failure I've spent months trying to correct." "I've heard about your reorganization," Joe acknowledged. "Reed Community Partners, clever PR move." "It's more than PR." For the first time, a flash of the old intensity returned to his eyes. "We've halted all evictions at Riverside and converted the redevelopment plan to mixed-income housing with current tenants given priority. The Rodriguez family you mentioned is helping design the children's play area." Joe's professional skepticism warred with her desire to believe him. "And the board approved this charitable impulse?" "Not initially," Nathaniel admitted. "There were, conversations. Eleanor helped. She's joining the board next month to oversee the foundation work." "Your father must be thrilled," Joe observed dryly. "He's adapting. The heart attack in February changed his perspective somewhat." Joe's expression softened. "I hadn't heard. Is he all right?" "Recovering," Nathaniel nodded. "It's made succession. Planning more urgent, which gave me leverage for the changes I wanted to implement." They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the garden, children laughing, birds returning from winter absence, filling the space between them. "Your book deal," Nathaniel said finally. "Congratulations. It's well-deserved." "Thank you." Joe hesitated. "How did you know about that?" "I still have connections in publishing." He smiled slightly. "I may have mentioned your name to some people, that's all." "I don't need your help, Nathaniel." "I know," he said quietly. "You never did. That was part of what made—" He stopped, recalibrating. "I didn't come here to disrupt your life again. I just wanted you to know that what you said that night, it mattered. It changed things. Changed me." Joe looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time since he'd appeared. The arrogance that had once seemed fundamental to his character had been replaced by something humbler, more authentic. "I'm glad," she said honestly. "For what it's worth, I think about our conversations at the estate sometimes, before everything fell apart." Nathaniel nodded. "We were almost friends by then, weren't we?" "Almost," Joe agreed. He stood respecting the boundary she'd established months ago. "The offer still stands, you know, not the original one. That was shameful. But if you ever want to discuss your book or housing policy or anything really, I'd like to hear your thoughts. As he turned to leave, Joe made a decision. Nathaniel? He paused. There's a community meeting next week about affordable housing initiatives in Dorchester. Reed Community Partners should probably have representation there. Is that a professional recommendation, Ms. Winters? A hint of their old banter returned to his voice. Consider it a journalistic observation, she replied. Tuesday, 7 o'clock, Dorchester Community Center. I'll be covering it for the Globe. I'll be there, he promised. Joe watched him walk away, this time without the desperation that had marked their previous parting. Whatever connection existed between them now was neither the false engagement they'd constructed nor the bitter disillusionment that had ended it. It was something new, tenuous, but potentially genuine. A bridge being carefully rebuilt between their separate worlds. She returned to her laptop, opening a new document. The cursor blinked on the empty page, waiting for words. Joe began to type. The distance between wealth and poverty in American cities is often measured in blocks, sometimes merely streets. But the true measure lies in perception. The ability to see beyond circumstances to the humanity that binds us all. The spring breeze turned the page of her notebook as Joe continued writing. The bench where their story had begun now witnessing its possible continuation. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.